Hello, and thank you for taking part in 2021's DiverseU Building Community. Before we begin, I would like to note that we are recording each DiverseU session so that we can make them accessible after the event is over. Please keep this in mind as you engage in this space, as your questions and comments will be included in the recording. DiverseU is a celebration of diversity. I'm sure we're all eager to find out what can be learned by attending these sessions, but first we have a few ground rules. DiverseU is an opportunity to engage in civil discourse and dialogue through listening and learning. The ground rules are in place to assist our presenters in maintaining dignity and respect in those spaces. So here are a few guidelines for participating in the discussion and how we can better serve and respect this learning experience for everyone involved. Guideline 1, communicate direct personal experience and not secondhand experiences. In doing so, we rely on I statements like, I was affected by an incident where, and I know in my own life I have experienced. Guideline 2, speak for yourself, not as a representative of any group or any other person. Along the same idea, do not single anyone out to be an expert in order to speak on behalf of any group. If you do wish to reference studies outside your own experience, we invite you to cite academic studies collected from the various academic journals and databases, such as those available through the Mansfield Library. Guideline 4, be respectful and courteous throughout each presentation, whether you agree with the speaker or not. Our central mission here is civil discourse. Be mindful of the amount of space you are taking up and allow others to share in the dialogue. Guideline 5, be mindful that many of the presenters are in a place of vulnerability due to the personal nature of each topic. As an institute of higher learning, we depend on the Student Conduct Code to ensure each presenter is treated with dignity and respect. Guideline 6, active listening is more than hearing. It is expressed in our presence in the room. Based on this fact, we ask that while you are in the learning space, you silence your phone. If you do need to talk or text on the phone, we ask that you respectfully step outside of the meeting space to tend to those communications. These rules apply to individuals and groups that are not students, and we will enforce them should poor conduct occur from any person. Thank you for coming, and now I will turn it over to our presenter to begin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Hunt, and I am a first-year doctoral candidate student in the anthropology program with the cultural heritage option. I want to thank you for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time and also for your support. I hope you enjoy my presentation, which is based on my master's thesis, which I recently defended this summer, titled Devastation and Displacement, the destruction of Native American lifeways resulting from the building of the Dalles Dam on the Columbia River in Oregon and the Garrison Dam on the Missouri River in North Dakota. While majoring in Native American studies to receive my bachelor's degree here 20 years ago, I was awakened to just how much is left out of history, especially regarding Native Americans and Indigenous people worldwide. I was educated and corrected toward many historical inaccuracies and inspired to advocate for social justice and activism. My current education in anthropology can provide an additional role in this type of advocacy. A quote I appreciate states, "The primary goal of anthropology remains to promote an empathetic appreciation of all humanity, an appreciation that should bring people together in common understanding." I had chosen to do my thesis as a multi-sided ethnohistory, as a result of learning about how rich life was for the Indigenous people before dams impacted their cultural areas. Another powerful quote states, "There is not a region nor a tribal area which has not been deeply affected by dams, whether in the past or the present, whether on Indian or adjacent lands. Dams have intruded on Indian people in major ways that require discussion and action." While growing up on the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, I learned about the flooding of Celilo Falls by the Dalles Dam. I had heard stories from elders who spoke of the abundance of salmon harvested since time immemorial and the heartbreak at the time of the inundation of Celilo Falls in 1957. Whenever we travel through the Columbia River Gorge, my family has always stopped at the park that was once the location of Celilo Falls to pray and give thanks to the Creator. In addition, after reading the book Coyote Warrior by Paul Vandevelder in one of my Native American Studies classes, I had learned about the flooding of over 150,000 acres by the Garrison Dam on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota in 1953, where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people had thrived for thousands of years. It flooded 9 native communities and was just as devastating as the stories I had grown up knowing about Celilo Falls. How have social adjustments for these communities evolved under the pressure of cultural change? How can we better understand how displacement has affected current physical, social, economic, and spiritual conditions of Native people? My thesis was based on the part the building of the dams and displacement has played on these communities. It could be argued shifts in their environments tied to the dams and the inundation of sacred land and water have shaped their current social identity and how people classify themselves and their social surroundings, which is a critical theme in studying the effects colonialism has continued to have on Indigenous people. Comparing these two dams' transformative consequences shows the uniqueness of the various tribal communities and cultural heritage. In both circumstances, Native Americans were afflicted by being removed from their homelands and having sacred land and water areas destroyed. Access to plentiful hunting and fishing areas were eliminated. Traditional ecological knowledge was affected, and promises made in previous treaties were violated. The needs of Native Americans were silenced by the lack of concern for harmful effects upon Native people's livelihoods before and after the dams. The Dalles Dam and Celilo Falls. The inundation of Celilo Falls by the building of the Dalles Dam is a heartbreaking tale of the loss of culture, land, economic resources, and a sacred way of life for Native people. Also known as the echo of water falling on the rocks, Celilo Falls was the greatest fishing area in the Pacific Northwest. It was an ingenious and incredibly brave way how the natives fished there, using the rocks and cliffs and building wooden planks, platforms, and scaffolds to get out over the rocks. Then they would use long spears or dip nets to catch the salmon as they swam up the rapids and waterfalls. The courageous way the natives who fished there were rewarded by repeated catches of up to 30, 40, and sometimes even 50-pound salmon by the tons, which is unheard of today. On March 10, 1957, the echoing sounds of the falling water upon the rocks was drowned out by the cries of the people. It felt to them as if they too were being flooded under the water of this sacred place. Celilo Falls and the Columbia River has been home to Native Americans, many now enrolled on the Umatilla Reservation, which consists of the Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla tribes, and from the Nez Perce tribe, or the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation, comprised of Wasco, Paiute, Thai, and Tenino tribes, and the Yakima Nation. In addition, many unenrolled Native people thrived along the Columbia at Celilo Falls, who were the Cascades, the Wishrams, the Clackamas, the Multnomas, the Hood Rivers, the Skillets, the Wyans, and many others who would come to be known as the River People or the Columbia River Indians. Indigenous people who depended on Celilo Falls regulated their lives to the upstream migration of the various species of salmon. Natives far and wide gathered there to trade for salmon and other valued commodities. Salmon tied people to each other and linked them all to the river. The river people shared a way of life based on the seasonal harvesting of fish, game, and wild plant foods. Their meticulous accumulated knowledge of the land and the river was a rich heritage. Those living closest to the Columbia River's greatest fishery depended heavily upon the enormous amount of salmon that was harvested and would often trade their surplus for other food. By the 1950s, Celilo Village was one of the oldest Native continuously inhabited communities. They consisted mainly of non-enrolled Columbia River people who lived year-round at Celilo Falls. Celilo Village was forcibly relocated to the far side of the railroad and highway, away from the river just before the dam was completed. World War II surplus housing was used to build the village, along with other faulty construction. The lack of resources caused rapid deterioration throughout the village. Furthermore, the location of the new village proved dangerous as the locals were forced to cross both the railroad and the highway to access the river. Horrible accounts of people, even children, were being hit by trains and cars trying to get to the river. It is currently home now to approximately 100 Native American residents, most enrolled in various tribes. It took over 50 years after the drowning of Celilo Falls for any renovations of desperately needed upgrades for housing or sewer to occur. The removal of Celilo Falls had taken everything from the Native people who had fished there, and what remains is small and sad. This is a picture that is currently a rest stop called Celilo off the interstate along the Columbia River Gorge. This is the park I mentioned earlier that my family stops at when we travel through the gorge. This is the area where the falls used to be located. And along here is where Celilo Village used to be before they relocated it to the other side over here, which the highway is now an interstate and the railroad. This is on the other side. This public park, this rest stop, has a huge, fancy, manicured lawn area with camping facilities and picnic tables for travelers or windsurfers. But on this far side of the park is a tiny little fenced off area with a chain link fence surrounding it and just one small dock. It is an in-lieu fishing site for enrolled tribal members only. That is a sad attempt to replace Celilo Falls. The Garrison Dam and Fort Berthold. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people had lived along the Missouri River bottomlands using traditional ecological knowledge since time immemorial. They made daily use of ceremonial and other prayer areas where medicines grew. The people of Fort Berthold had lived by a natural economy in the Missouri Valley, with indigenous relationships to their ancestral lands. Their ancestors had passed down traditional lifeways through thousands of ceremonial areas, earth lodge village sites, burial grounds, hunting camps, and battle sites. The land itself, as well as the river area, the land itself, as well as the river, was sacred and integral to the foundation of their spiritual beliefs. The flooded areas were their homes, where they had farmed the rich bottomlands. Crops such as beans, sunflowers, squash, pumpkins, tobacco, and corn were grown in a deliberate process. They consistently planned and stored their agricultural products to sustain them in bad years. Various fruit, including chokecherries, buffalo berries, wild plums, and grapes, grew wild. In addition, they were able to hunt wild game such as deer, elk, antelope, or bison along the bottomlands when the cold of winter drove the animals down into the well-timbered valley floor. In addition, they obtained catfish, sturgeon, turtles, and freshwater mussels from the Missouri River. The creation of the Garrison Dam that flooded the Fort Berthold Reservation in 1953 caused irreparable destruction, flooding over 150,000 acres, over 1/4 of their reservation, and displaced over 90% of the population of the native people who lived and thrived there. The Garrison Dam effectively flooded the heart of the community land base, basically splitting up the entire reservation and separating the communities. The reservation villages of Sainish, Elbow Woods, Lucky Mound, Shell Creek, Nishu, Charging Eagle, Beaver Creek, Red Butte, Independence, and Van Hook were all buried under the reservoir of what is now known as Lake Sakakawea. One quote states, "The most devastating effects suffered by a single reservation were experienced by the 3 affiliated tribes of the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, whose tribal life was almost totally destroyed by the Garrison Dam." The construction of the Garrison Dam was the first project of the Pick-Sloan Plan, put together by the United States Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the US government during the time of the Flood Control Act of 1944. The locations of the Missouri River dams were deliberately chosen so that the reservoirs would spare white towns and instead flood native lands. Political considerations were the primary reasons the dams and reservoirs were designed and built at locations so devastating to native people. The US government forced this legislation upon the 3 tribes. The building of the Garrison Dam and the flooding of tribal lands on the Fort Berthold Reservation ranks among the most profound, systematic, and least remembered violations on Indigenous people to this day. Gone were the close traditional gatherings and community living. Flooded were the natural resources, including desirable land for agriculture, timber that provided logs for homes, natural food sources, and wildlife habitats, which could never be compensated for what was lost. After the relocation to dry, high ground, the three affiliated tribes found it almost impossible to grow their food. Wild game had vanished, the wells were contaminated to drink, and there was not enough water to grow crops that had flourished before the building of the dam. So they were forced to leave the river bottomland and their homes for treeless, waterless, relatively barren prairies. Since the flooding of the reservation, people have suffered dramatically with the displacement and dispersal of their population. The uprooting of kinship was detrimental to their livelihood, community, and culture. The adverse experiences of the three tribes can be described as transgenerational trauma. This trauma inflicted on displaced people is severe. To be wrenched from one's homeland is especially difficult for people and their ancestors who had derived most of their support from local resources for as long as they can remember. These dams are only two examples of countless others that have negatively impacted Indigenous communities, not only in this country, but worldwide. The protesting by the people against these dams was important, yet dismissed, and the meager compensation that resulted would never replace what was lost. There were ways these events could have been prevented. Other areas these dams could have been built. Yet the cries of the people were ignored, and the trauma that took place remains, passed on generationally, or by the elders remaining who still remember what life was like before the dams. Dams have turned Indigenous communities and many others worldwide into sacrifice zones, or communities that have been permanently impaired by environmental or developmental damage, sacrificed on purpose. Yet, despite formidable circumstances, many Indigenous people have adapted to purposeful changes in their livelihood, cultural, and religious traditions. Native people from these communities continue ceremonies of thanks to their creator and vigorous attempts to keep their culture alive. They are attempting to make sure the following generations never forget the sacredness of their past and fight to encourage hopefulness for their future. These stories need to be told to remind us of those for whom we presume to speak for. These are the works cited that I used. And these are the images. I wanted to just say a little tiny blurb about, for my dissertation that I'm doing for the PhD program, I plan to add to my master's thesis by adding additional dams and tribes from the same two rivers who were affected. On the Columbia River, I'm adding the Bonneville Dam, which is actually pretty close to the Dalles Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam, which affected many tribes in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. I've also been researching the Oahe Dam, the Fort Randall Dam, and the Big Bend Dam in South Dakota, which affected additional reservations in South Dakota, such as Standing Rock, the Cheyenne River Sioux, the Crow Creek Tribe, and the Lower Brule Tribe. In addition, I have been researching salvage archaeology that occurred before and after the building of these dams. I have been looking into the river basin surveys, the Missouri River Basin projects, the Columbia River Basin surveys, and the Interagency Archaeological and Paleontological Salvage Program. Thank you very much, and I'm available for any questions you may have. And get out of here.
Hi, my name is Alani, and I have a question about the dam itself. You said that it was used to generate hydropower, right?
Both of the dams did generate hydropower, and they were supposed to help with flooding and provide irrigation and electricity, were the purpose behind the government, the Corps of Engineers, and the Bureau of Reclamation, which is basically what most dams are supposed to provide.
Gotcha. So a lot of people say that dams are really important to transitioning to renewable or clean energy to combat the climate crisis and environmental issues. Do you think that we should be excluding dams from, or like not building dams in the future because of the outsized impact it has on indigenous peoples?
Well, dams have actually had a lot of negative consequences on wildlife, fish, and just a lot of different ecological negative effects have occurred. I don't know that I'd say no dam should ever be built again, but the research that I'm focusing on are ones that have deliberately affected certain Native communities. In my research, there were other options of places where these dams could have been built, where these Native lands wouldn't have been destroyed, basically, or they're, in the case of Celilo Falls, the water area that was so plentiful for them. There was a lot of Native Americans that did go to court, to the Supreme Court, to fight the dams, and there were lots of other options of places where these dams could have been built, and even ones that wouldn't have flooded white communities over Native communities. But in my research, I found that it was cheaper. It really became down a lot to money, why they chose these specific areas to flood. And in the case of Celilo Falls, there was some research that I found that talked about how they actually wanted to rid the enormous population of Native Americans that gathered in that particular area, because it was unsightly, or it affected some of the touristy towns that were up and coming along the gorge. So I just think that more respect and preparation and honoring and listening to the people who will be affected so dramatically is absolutely important, and was not considered. And this happens worldwide. There are indigenous communities worldwide that they have, they're flooding indigenous lands worldwide. And it does most of the time basically come down to it's cheaper. Thank you for your question, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions, or anyone in the Zoom? You can put your questions in the chat. Right, well, I think we will end it there then. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.